I didn't ease into that night. It didn't warm up, it didn't hint, it didn't suggest. It came straight at us like a verdict delivered by people who thought paper rules made them kings. The first thing I heard wasn't shouting. It was the kind of knock that isn't a request. It was the sound of someone convinced my front door belonged to them, convinced my life came with a handle they could grab. My wife was 8 months pregnant, sleeping on the couch because the baby liked the hum of the ceiling fan, and the instant I stood up, I already knew who this was. It wasn't a neighbor, it wasn't confusion, it was HOA Karen's thugs arriving after dark because daylight makes cowards nervous. When I opened the door, they were already standing too close, already on my property, already rehearsing their lines behind their expressions. 2 men dressed like authority and built like insecurity. Black jackets, cheap badges, clipboards they held like weapons they didn't know how to use. They didn't say hello. They announced compliance. They spoke like sentences were handcuffs, and like saying HOA enforcement made them untouchable. I moved between them and my wife without thinking. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. There is a way a person stands when the situation has just crossed from irritation into danger, and I stood that way. They said the word violation like they enjoyed it. They said immediate correction like the house belonged to them, and we were lucky to live inside it. They smirked in my doorway at night because HOA Karen had trained them to believe rules were a personality. When my wife stood up slowly behind me, one hand supporting her stomach, the temperature of the entire scene changed. One of them looked at her belly and didn't see a child, or a life, or a family he had just invaded. He saw leverage. That was the moment I knew exactly how far this would go if I let them. This wasn't about trash cans or fences or paint. This was about control. This was about HOA Karen deciding that our home was her theater, and our fear was her entertainment. They stepped closer again. Not enough to call it an attack, just enough to see if they could take space from us without asking. Just enough to measure how much fear they could extract in one visit. I told them to leave. One of them laughed, not because anything was funny, but because humiliation is a habit when you work for someone like HOA Karen. They said they had the right to enter. They said refusal wasn't allowed. They said they could guide my wife back inside like her body was part of their checklist. His hand moved past me toward her, and the world narrowed. I don't remember whether I shouted. I remember the sound of her foot slipping. I remember the sharp breath she took when balance failed. I remember time opening up into something long and vicious as her arm caught the edge of the step at the wrong angle. The sound wasn't dramatic. It was dull. It was final. It was the sound of something that doesn't bounce back. She didn't scream immediately. Shock wrapped her in silence. Then pain arrived like a wave breaking over rock. And she folded herself around our child, while her broken arm hung wrong in the porch light. The thugs froze for half a second, the half second where people realize consequences exist, and then they started talking fast, not apologizing, not helping, reframing, rewriting, already building the lie they were going to tell HOA Karen, the story where she tripped, where nothing happened, where they were polite professionals, and we were the problem. Lights turned on across the street. Phones appeared. A neighborhood turned into witnesses without saying a word, and the men straightened like actors suddenly aware of cameras. They told me to calm down. They told me it was under control. They told me to stay back from my own wife on my own property because HOA Karen's voice was echoing inside their skulls even when she wasn't there. I knelt beside my wife and spoke softly, because panic doesn't help broken things heal. Her arm was already swelling, already bending in a direction arms don't go, and I felt rage press against discipline like an animal against glass. I didn't break the glass. Not yet. Sirens cut through the night and painted their faces blue and red. The thugs walked toward the officers like co-workers, like this was a meeting instead of a crime scene. They spoke first, like guilty people always try to do, confident in the script HOA Karen had trained them to recite. They said non-compliance. They said unfortunate incident. They made rules sound more urgent than pain. The officers looked at my wife on the ground. They looked at me. Then they looked at the men pretending to be important. And confusion settled into the air like fog. Confusion is dangerous because whoever speaks first often wins. So I didn't give speeches. I gave facts. Short, direct, precise. While paramedics arrived, the thugs kept talking, building story after story, as if volume could erase reality. The paramedics ignored them. They splinted my wife's arm, monitored the baby, worked with hands that didn't shake, and every professional movement made the men smaller. The baby's heartbeat was strong. That sound held me together. When they rolled her toward the ambulance, one of the men tried handing an officer a stack of violation papers like proof we deserved this. That was the moment everything fell into place. This wasn't an accident of enforcement gone too far. This was exactly how HOA Karen operated. Intimidate first, justify later, hurt people in the name of rules, and then bury the harm inside paperwork. The police separated us. They took statements. The men talked too much. I let them. Every extra word they said was another rope tightening around their own throats. A neighbor walked forward and said they had video. Another said they had audio. The thugs' confidence cracked like ice under weight. At the hospital, while doctors checked my wife and watched the baby's heartbeat on a monitor, I replayed the night not as trauma but as evidence. They had crossed from nuisance into violence under the direction of HOA Karen. They had touched my family. They had turned authority into costume and used it like a weapon. This wasn't going to end in conversation. It wasn't going to end with an apology letter signed, "Regretfully, the board." It was going to end with consequences that didn't need my anger to move. By the time the fracture was confirmed and the baby declared safe, the decision was already made. Not revenge, exposure, not noise, precision. They thought the night ended with an ambulance and a report. They were wrong. That night was the beginning of the end of their careers because HOA Karen built her power on fear, and she had just given me something stronger than fear: documentation with teeth. I stayed upright because collapsing helps no one, because someone had to be the anchor in a scene deliberately shaken loose by people who confused authority with costume. The ride to the hospital was a tunnel of fluorescent ceilings and beeping monitors, a corridor where every footstep sounded like an accusation, and behind every sound was the same name pulsing through my skull: HOA Karen. The thugs weren't improvising. They were following culture. They were doing what she rewarded. In the ambulance, my wife's voice was thin but steady, asking if the baby was okay before she asked anything about herself. And I answered even before the medic did, because certainty is medicine in moments where fear wants to multiply. The medic listened again and nodded once, and that nod kept the world from falling apart. I watched the city pass in fragments through the back doors while I memorized the details of the night. Not because I'm sentimental, but because memory is a weapon when people like HOA Karen try to rewrite what they break. I promised myself there would be no forgetting, no rounding off edges, no softening the facts to make anyone comfortable. Pain has a texture when it is manufactured by arrogance, and I recorded every grain of it. In the hospital room, the air smelled like antiseptic and restraint, and my wife's face was pale with pain she refused to give voice to, because she didn't want to scare the child she was still carrying. I held her good hand and told her what I already knew was true. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't fate having a bad night. This was HOA Karen's culture reaching into our house and finding consequences. When the doctor confirmed the fracture, when he said the words consistent with fall and noted pregnancy as a risk factor, he might as well have been reading a verdict out loud. I didn't argue, I didn't rage, I didn't threaten. I listened, and I stored every syllable. Even before dawn, I understood the shape of what came next. The long, quiet process that terrifies control freaks more than shouting ever could. HOA Karen believed fear kept people obedient, but she had just gifted me something fear cannot compete with: clarity. I watched my wife sleep at last, exhausted, held together by splints and stubbornness, and I made a decision I did not say out loud because saying it wasn't necessary. It lived in the way I straightened the papers on the side table, in the way I looked at the clock and noted the time, in the way I wrote the first line in a notebook that would become a map straight to the collapse of every career tied to this. I didn't pray for strength. I filed for certainty. I didn't wish for justice. I prepared it. The night that began with a knock pretending to be procedure ended with documentation stronger than every lie HOA Karen would try to build, and as the first color of morning bled into the blinds, I understood without ceremony that nothing in their lives would go back to how it was before they decided my wife was leverage. We did not arrive in this neighborhood looking for a fight. We arrived looking for quiet, for the kind of stability people work years to earn, for mornings where the loudest noise is a bird on the fence, and evenings that end with porch light instead of worry. The house was chosen carefully, not because it was grand, but because it felt rooted, because it sat at the edge of trees and carried the kind of silence that makes you believe you can finally exhale. We signed paperwork like everyone signs paperwork, thick packets filled with small print and promises about community standards that sounded cooperative rather than coercive. And in those first days, nothing about the words suggested what would eventually be done with them in HOA Karen's hands. She wasn't a rumor yet. She was just a name printed on letters, tucked between formal language and the illusion of neighborly intent. Authority, when legitimate, doesn't need to posture. And that was why the early notices didn't stir any alarm in me. A bin left visible, a car parked wrong by a few inches, reminders written in the kind of tone that pretends concern while training obedience, and we corrected them because normal people correct small things and move on. My wife laughed at first, one hand on her belly as it began to show, joking that some people need hobbies, and I let myself believe that was all this was. But power in small places attracts people who are hungry for it, and HOA Karen was the kind of person who studied rules not to follow them, but to weaponize them. Meetings revealed the truth slowly. She sat at the front with the posture of someone who believes geography gives them the right to dominate, speaking in polished phrases about property values and shared responsibility. Her voice wrapped in courtesy, while her eyes measured who nodded and who didn't. People agreed out of exhaustion rather than conviction. And the room learned early that questioning her came with cost, that she enjoyed the subtle humiliation of making dissenters repeat themselves while pretending not to understand. I recognized the signs because I know what real chains of command look like, and this wasn't one. This was theater in which one person plays government and expects applause. Authority is proven by process, not by volume, and Karen had volume and proximity, but not legitimacy. The pregnancy shifted the air around us in ways that had nothing to do with paint colors or lawn height. We became visible, and visible people are useful in the minds of those who want to demonstrate power. The letters changed tone, deadlines shortened, language hardened while pretending not to, and every reminder carried an undercurrent that said we were being watched more closely now. I noticed the timing first, how notices arrived after dusk or early morning, how conversations at the mailbox stalled when Karen passed as though sound itself owed her deference, and how board members spoke about her with admiration that sounded too much like fear. Then came the enforcement firm, introduced with a smile and a script about support for the board, a solution to workload, as if intimidation were an administrative task. The vote wasn't a decision. It was a ceremony crowning what she had already chosen. The first time I saw them walking the neighborhood like predators who thought sidewalks were hunting lanes, measuring porches with their eyes and knocking without names, I understood that Karen had finally given her impulses legs. They weren't there to maintain standards. They were there to manufacture submission. I followed procedures for a living, and because of that I knew exactly how fake authority moves. Louder, closer, and dumber than the real thing. They spoke in commands instead of requests. They lingered instead of leaving. They treated property lines like invitations. None of it was accident. All of it was culture, and HOA Karen was the culture. My wife stopped laughing. She began checking windows before she sat down, listening for footsteps when night fell, sleeping more lightly not because of the baby but because of the uncertainty outside our walls. The house that was supposed to be safety became a place you monitor, and nothing poisons peace faster than turning your home into a lookout point. I documented quietly, not out of paranoia, but out of discipline, because people like Karen rewrite history with confidence and rely on everyone else having short memory. I wrote dates. I wrote times. I noted tone, posture, distance from the door, how long they stayed after being told to leave, and how often the letters mentioned compliance while ignoring humanity. Behind every line, HOA Karen positioned herself one step removed, never present at the mess she created, always claiming she was just enforcing what others agreed to, pretending inevitability while pulling every string herself. That separation wasn't accidental. It was strategy. It allowed her to play queen without ever dirtying her hands, while the people she sent did the kind of work that breaks bones and then calls it policy. The night they showed up, and my wife fell, wasn't a mistake or a sudden storm. It was the logical conclusion of a system designed by someone who believes rules are weapons and neighbors are pieces on her board. Understanding that didn't comfort me. It clarified me. It told me exactly who did this even when she wasn't physically there, exactly whose name belonged on every document I was about to file, and exactly why this wasn't just about us anymore, but about every person she had trained to live small in their own homes. That is what HOA Karen called authority. What she actually built was abuse. HOA Karen did not rule by accident. She ruled by design, and the design was simple. Keep everyone slightly afraid all the time and make sure no one could trace the fear directly back to her without work. She built layers the way other people build fences, each one meant to slow anyone who tried to push back. At the top was her voice, polished and pleasant when microphones were near, clipped and cold when she spoke off the record. Beneath that sat a board that pretended to deliberate, but in reality waited for her cues, like stage actors terrified of missing their lines. Beneath committees, with titles that sounded cooperative and existed to convert her preferences into policy, and beneath that were the thugs she hired, the enforcement extension she could disown if anything went wrong, while quietly rewarding them when things went exactly as she intended. I watched it piece by piece, until the picture stopped being murky and became obvious. Rules did not live on paper here. They lived in HOA Karen's mood. If she disliked someone, bylaws discovered new interpretations. If she favored someone, violations vanished like smoke. Power became personal, and personal power in small neighborhoods is the most dangerous kind because it convinces insecure people they are sovereign in other people's lives. She loved meeting minutes because they were her script, edited after the fact, cleaned of tone and threat, leaving only the parts that made her look composed and necessary. Those minutes were her shield, while her thugs were her sword. They didn't just patrol, they prowled. They didn't just check compliance, they hunted opportunities to demonstrate dominance. I saw how they paused longer in front of homes belonging to the elderly, how they pushed harder where English wasn't first language, how they targeted families already stretched thin because resistance takes energy, and HOA Karen counted on exhaustion. She didn't need to shout, she just needed to choose targets correctly. She hid behind phrases like community standards and property values while privately enjoying what she would never say out loud. That power felt good and control tasted better. I learned the rhythm of her abuse the way you learn a storm pattern. First came the letter with soft words and sharp implications. Then came the follow-up with less softness and more deadline. Then came the unannounced visit by her enforcers who stood too close and spoke too loudly, letting their presence do what their non-existent legal authority could not. Everything they did relied on one assumption, that people would rather submit than fight a system designed to tire them out. And mostly people did. They paid the fines, they apologized, they shrank inside their own homes so that Karen could feel larger inside hers. The cruelty was quiet but precise, and pretending it was accidental was part of the performance. Nothing about what happened to my wife began that night. It began the first time HOA Karen realized no one was going to stop her from treating the neighborhood like a kingdom where she made the rules and rewrote the consequences. What she didn't understand yet was that kingdoms fall fastest when the person who built them refuses to believe gravity applies to them. The men who my wife saw not the honest expression of her rule. They were what happens when self-importance is given a badge, even a fake one, and told to find people's lives. They carried her name in the yard, even if they didn't, and stepped in spirit, if not made. You cannot dismantle what you don't understand, and by the cross other people's hands. While everyone had spent years perfecting what she wanted done so she could pretend surprise when acts finally drew blood. The problem for her was simple and fatal. Distance protects you from blame only until you're untouchable. I knew it made it traceable. Right after all, sleep. Silence has weight when it follows impact. Something on the of I did not pace, and I did not rage. I worked. I turned it into an operating space, because chaos only wins, stays scattered. I laid down the first letter we ever received from the HOA, then the second, then the third. A line of paper that slowly turned into a map of intent. Patterns appeared the way bruises do, darker over time, impossible to miss once you finally look straight at them. The frequency surged after the enforcement firm arrived. The tone sharpened the moment my wife's pregnancy became visible. Deadlines shrank, threats swelled. I did not exaggerate a single thing, already precise enough to be devastating. I added email. Every message was time-stamped, every voicemail download, contact log. I didn't curate, I preserved. Power thrives on missing context, and I refused to give HOA Karen a luxury of ambiguity. Security footage came next, backed up to multiple drives, labeled by date and angle. I watched her thugs circle property lines that weren't theirs, linger at windows they had no right to approach, return multiple times in a day without the issuing notices because intimidation, not correction, was the point. Their confidence on camera was almost casual, the confidence of people who believe they are protected by someone whose name no one wants to challenge out loud. The audio was worse than the video. Tone survives microphones more honestly than words. I heard command slip into threat, threat decay into mockery, and mockery bloom into laughter as they spoke about families like ours as obstacles instead of people. That laughter became the first nail in the coffin of their careers, because juries and judges recognize contempt without needing subtitles. I requested credentials formally because formality leaves footprints. Licensing numbers came back crooked. Company addresses led to rented mailboxes. Insurance documents contradicted themselves. It stopped looking sloppy and started looking constructed, something assembled to look official enough to scare people who wouldn't check. I checked, then I checked again. I cross-referenced bylaws against state statutes and watched their authority evaporate line by line. The powers they claimed didn't exist anywhere but in their mouths. They had built an entire intimidation regime on the hope that no one would ever read past the letterhead. The county clerk confirmed the final piece with the weary tone of someone used to watching amateurs impersonate institutions. The enforcement addendum, HOA Karen waved like a royal decree, had never been properly filed or ratified. On paper, it was nothing. In practice, it had already broken my wife's arm. I documented that call the same way I documented everything else. Date, time, name, exact language. Paper cuts can bleed organizations dry, and I intended for this stack to do exactly that. Neighbors began to appear like witnesses emerging from fog. A woman who had been blocked in her own driveway. A veteran fined for a flag placement. A family harassed over a ramp their child needed simply to enter their house. They had been quiet, not because nothing happened to them, but because silence felt safer when HOA Karen watched everything. They stopped being quiet when they realized someone was building something stronger than outrage. I promised them nothing except accuracy, and accuracy was enough. Medical records arrived next. They did not exaggerate. They did not dramatize. They simply described fracture mechanism consistent with fall caused by external disruption. Pregnancy listed as risk multiplier. Fetal monitoring conducted. Complications assessed. Every word landed where Karen would eventually try to pretend nothing serious occurred. Police reports followed the same slow trajectory from confusion toward clarity. Initial statements from the thugs contradicted each other. Bodycam footage contradicted them both. Timelines failed to match anything except the truth written in the hospital and recorded on the cameras. HOA. Karen tried to freeze the story with a statement calling the situation unfortunate and under review. Language like that is meant to stall momentum, but momentum had already shifted because proof has its own gravity, and I had built enough of it to move worlds. Requests for records turned into legal obligations instead of favors. There were contracts to produce, emails to surrender, board communications that suddenly mattered more than the image she had curated for years. Replies slowed, then they splintered, then they contradicted each other. A former board member contacted me quietly, voice low, fear obvious, and confirmed what the documents already implied. HOA Karen had hired that firm specifically because, in her own words, it would push harder. Those words lived now on more than one tongue, and soon on more than one page. Discovery did not make me feel triumphant. It made me feel precise. It stripped away every excuse she would try, every defense she would offer, until all that remained was what actually happened and the system she constructed to make it possible. By the time I finished building the record, the conclusion had already written itself. HOA Karen believed fear was power. She was about to learn that evidence is stronger. The day I chose for the confrontation did not choose me. I chose it the way a surgeon chooses where to cut, with intention and without ceremony. HOA Karen still believed she owned the rhythm of the neighborhood, believed she controlled who spoke and who stayed quiet, believed her minutes and memos could smother anything that threatened her narrative. She walked into the community space composed, surrounded by the board that echoed her expressions, like reflections in crooked glass. And she wore the same smile she always wore when she thought the ending was already written. The thugs stood near the back, arms crossed, trying to look like they didn't belong to her, while every gesture betrayed that they did. Neighbors gathered not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, the way animals recognize weather about to break. I wasn't there to perform. I wasn't there to shout. I was there to remove oxygen from her lies. When I spoke, I didn't describe how I felt. I described what happened. I placed events in order like numbered stones and walked everyone across them one at a time. I didn't embellish a single word. I didn't need to. Dates, knocks, threats, the fall, the ambulance, the fracture, the baby, all laid down in a line no one could twist without looking ridiculous. Throw away. Karen tried to interrupt with the tone of someone used to interrupting into victory, but evidence makes interruptions small. I referenced video first without playing it, watched her posture stiffen, then watched her board members realize this wasn't a complaint they could file away. The first clip played, and the room changed shape. There was no distance anymore, no insulation, no unfortunate misunderstanding. There were her thugs on my property after dark, too close, too confident, too sure she would protect them from consequences the way she always had. Audio followed, their voice with contempt they could never unsay. Laughter where fear lived, command where request should have been, threats pretended to be procedure. Silence fell in a way that didn't need to be enforced. You could feel the moment where denial stopped being available to anyone paying attention. HOA Karen tried to recover the way she always had, reaching for policy language like a lifeline. But words like unfortunate and under review break apart when placed beside broken bones and recorded arrogance. She switched to intimidation because that was the only language she truly spoke fluently. Fines, violations, removal from the premises. She said those things out loud in a room filled with witnesses and officers and recording devices, and every syllable landed not as control, but as confession. The officers did not stand beside her this time. They stood in front of her. They asked for credentials she could not produce and contracts she could not display without unraveling the structure she pretended was legitimate. Her thugs shrank visibly when their laughter echoed back at them from speakers, when they heard themselves speak about my wife as if she were an obstacle instead of a human being. Their bravado drained into the carpet. Neighbors who had stayed quiet stepped forward in measured voices, adding their own timelines, their own harassment, their own nights of being watched in homes they paid for. HOA Karen looked for allies on the board and found only people staring at the table because looking at her meant complicity, and they were suddenly interested in survival. You could see the exact second where she realized control was no longer an option, but habit kept her talking anyway, each word smaller than the last, each sentence eroding the persona she had built. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I did not need to. Gravity was doing the work now. Authority shifted in the room not with noise but with attention. People stopped listening to her and started listening to documentation. And that is the moment any tyrant in any small kingdom actually falls. The confrontation with a fight, not with a dramatic exit, but with a stillness that humiliated more than shouting ever could. HOA Karen did not storm out. She diminished. Her enforcers backed away physically, the way people do when they suddenly realize they are standing too close to the truth, and the truth has teeth. Officers separated parties again, but this time the questions were different. They weren't about what happened. They were about authority, licensing, contracts, and the legal right to do anything she had done. She did not have answers that survived contact with reality. The room emptied slowly while she remained seated, staring at papers that had finally stopped obeying her. The collapse had already happened by the time the last chair scraped back. It wasn't loud. It was permanent. Retaliation didn't look like rage in motion. It looked like paperwork assembled with surgical calm, deadlines met without emotion, and signatures that carried more force than any threat HOA Karen had ever spoken. Once the confrontation stripped away her costume of inevitability, the work shifted from public exposure to private precision. I retained professionals not because I needed validation, but because systems speak most clearly to their own language, and the language now was legal, regulatory, financial, and clinical. Attorneys did not posture. They documented. Investigators did not speculate. They verified. Regulators did not argue. They notified. Every agency that mattered received exactly what it needed, organized so there was no room for Karen's usual fog of confusion to seep in. What she had called policy enforcement was translated cleanly into trespass, harassment, negligence, fraud, impersonation of authority, and reckless endangerment of a pregnant woman. Those words were not insults. They were categories, and categories have consequences. The enforcement firm she hid behind was peeled open like a hollow prop. Licenses didn't match databases. Addresses evaporated into rented mailboxes. Insurance carriers recognized gaps large enough to drive liability straight through. The facade she relied on had never been built to withstand anyone actually checking, and now checking was unavoidable, routine, and documented. The men who served her ambition discovered the speed at which loyalty dies when penalty becomes personal. Their statements changed tone. Their recollections became specific. Their emails surfaced. The bravado they had worn on my porch transformed into cooperation in fluorescent rooms where every word was recorded and every inconsistency mattered. They did what people always do when power lapses. They pointed upward. Their fingers didn't waver. They pointed to HOA Karen. The board fractured completely under the pressure of real scrutiny. Emergency meetings were called, then canceled, then rescheduled behind closed doors that no longer meant protection. Members resigned not out of conscience, but out of fear, each one trying to step off the sinking structure before it was officially declared a wreck. Karen remained at the center, the architect finally forced to stand inside what she built while it failed. Financial audits became another blade. Payments were traced. Invoices examined. Duplicate billing emerged. Funds moved in ways that looked less like administration and more like convenience masked as process. Every irregularity became another weight added to an already buckling frame. Meanwhile, the medical documentation remained untouched and unspinnable. Doctors wrote what they saw and what caused it, and their language carried an authority Karen could not mimic. Injury consistent with fall secondary to external disruption. Pregnancy risk increased by incident. Pain management required. Phrases she could not dilute or soften or vote away. Police supplemental reports added to the gravity with body camera timestamps that cared nothing for her reputation. Cease and desist orders landed. Temporary injunctions followed. The apparatus she had used to make neighbors small was unplugged in stages until it stopped moving entirely. She issued one more email full of the same empty phrases she had always relied on, invoking misunderstandings and ongoing reviews, but the difference now was simple and devastating. No one cared. The audience she ruled by fear no longer existed. They had stepped out from under her, and she could not call them back. Depositions were scheduled, not discussed. Evidence was indexed, not argued. The future of the case no longer depended on my endurance or her personality. It depended on process, and process could not be intimidated. HOA Karen, who had lived for years in the illusion that control was something you could perform into existence, now found herself controlled by calendars, statutes, signatures, and recordings that did not bend when she raised her voice. She was still talking when the reality had already passed beyond the reach of her words. What came for her career wasn't revenge, it was consequence. And consequence is quiet only to people who have never heard it arrive at their own door. Victory didn't come with applause, and it didn't need to. It arrived the way real endings do, in envelopes, in signatures, in quiet confirmations spoken by people who don't dramatize their work because the work is heavy enough on its own. The neighborhood changed sound first. The constant background tension that had lived under every doorstep simply vanished, replaced by a kind of ordinary silence that felt unfamiliar only because fear had been normal for too long. The thugs stopped appearing, not gradually, but completely, as if someone had reached into the script of the place and erased their lines. The enforcement firm dissolved in paperwork and penalty, stripped of every pretend credential it had waved around like a badge when it stood on my porch. What more was what happened to HOA Karen, because every thread in this story led back to her hands, no matter how hard she had tried to keep them clean. Orders arrived that did not ask for her opinion. Licenses that had once looked like armor were revoked without ceremony. Authority she had treated like personal property was suspended and then removed, replaced not with another tyrant, but with vacancy, an empty chair at the head of a table where she had once performed control. She issued one last statement in the same polished tone she had always used, words about misunderstanding and regret, and not a single person adjusted their life in response to it. Influence dies faster than titles, and hers died first. Board members resigned in clusters, not looking at one another on their way out because eye contact implies shared responsibility, and they were finished sharing anything except silence. Meetings were canceled indefinitely, notices stopped arriving, and mailboxes stopped carrying threats disguised as reminders. Neighbors began speaking in full voices again, not whispering at fences, not checking over shoulders before telling the truth about what had been happening all along. The community didn't become sentimental. It simply became unafraid. That was enough. At home, my wife healed one day at a time, slow and stubborn in the way real recovery. Her arm regained strength, the baby continued to grow, and every appointment, every scan, every clinical note existed as permanent record of what HOA Karen's choices had risked. Those pages will outlive her emails. They will outlast her career. They will stand in drawers and archives and systems where she cannot reach to edit or erase, saying in clean professional language exactly what her hunger for control cost. Settlements finalized without drama. Restrictions were imposed. Procedures changed in ways she never would have allowed had she still believed she owned the place. People learned how to recognize the difference between community and control, between rules meant to protect and rules meant to dominate. And though no one wrote speeches about it, the absence of her shadow over their front doors was the only proof anyone needed. I did not celebrate. Celebration belongs to moments that surprise you, and this ending didn't surprise me at all. It followed the only path it could once the truth had weight behind it. I walked to the property line she once crossed through other people, and stood there long enough to notice that nothing happened. No footsteps, no knock dressed up as procedure, no voices pretending ownership of what they never built. Morning light came through the same kitchen window it always had, but for the first time since we moved in, it didn't have to compete with dread. HOA Karen did not call. She did not show up. She did not demand. Her career didn't explode. It simply collapsed inward until it stopped existing in places where it used to be unavoidable. There were no lessons to announce and no moral to extract. There was only this. They backed away from our property without a word and did not return, and not one of them could look us in the eye again.